It's an honor to be here. I'm a poor substitute for John Armour, but I would like to just give some highlights of what I have learned and what I see and how I apply them to our world that I have learned from this very profound book. And let's just talk a little bit about this book itself. Now, I think General Meese and Susan and Michelle have kind of given you a little bit of an idea of what this book is, but it's like John Armour went rummaging around in America's attic, and he found under some piles of old curtains, he had some sort of silver object there, and it was in a couple of pieces. And he took it down from the attic, and he polished it very carefully, and he put it back together. It was an old gift to America that people had forgotten, and John Armour, may he rest in peace, went up there into our attic, got it, polished it, put it together, and he has re-gifted us this great work. What he's done is given us the forgotten founder. Thomas Paine really is not known to many Americans. I would venture a wild guess to say most children in high school don't even know who he is. Most college-educated Americans have never read Thomas Paine. But now it's easily read, thanks to John Armour, because what he's done is he's given us effectively the encyclopedia of Thomas Paine in the cantos that General Meese just mentioned. He has assembled all of the bits and parts from Common Sense, The Age of Reason, all of the other works in accessible, readable parts. There is on tyranny. There is on Republican government. There is on war. The places that you would have to see to go and read those and find those all yourself, it must have taken John Armour months, if not years, to do all of that. I'm just a journalist for the working day. I do things in quite a rush most of the time, and I'm envious, really, when someone can take this scholarly approach that John did and give us this great gift again that Thomas Paine had given us so many other years ago. Well, a lot of people, I'm sure, would say that, yeah, we ought to read Thomas Paine, and it's kind of an historical study, as if we would read the Greeks or read Sun Tzu. And if only we would read the Greeks or study the art of war. But if you look throughout the works of the Founding Fathers, you see Thomas Paine's words and thoughts again and again and again. Just as one thing, Paine makes the case for the Declaration of Independence. And in Common Sense, Paine wrote, "Society in every state is a blessing, but government, even in its best state, is but a necessary evil. In its worst state, an intolerable one." Now, of course, Jefferson, we would know this not, unless John Armour had shown it to us, but John shows us how Jefferson borrowed that and used it, translated into his own words, and made it part of the Declaration of Independence to secure these rights. Governments are instituted among men, deriving their just power from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or abolish it. If you study Paine, and now we all can, the Federalist Papers, the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, you will find, as John Armour guides us through the annotations, a lot of parallels like that. Tonight, I just wanted to illustrate a bit how similar America's problems are today to the ones they had in Thomas Paine's time. But also, and this is the unfortunate part, how different the American character is from the character that was common amongst our colonial ancestors. How many of the troubles that we face today are the same or similar to the ones that our colonial ancestors faced? The unfortunate answer to that question is a sufficient number to raise in even the most calm and sober of minds the question of whether our nation can continue to exist, and if so, whether we can continue to enjoy the freedoms protected by our Constitution. We are a nation at war, facing a relentless enemy that is both abroad and within our own society, and as in Paine's day, we are not united against it. We are a people divided politically, religiously, ethnically, and even racially to a degree unseen in our lifetimes. Americans, to a dangerous degree, have forgotten the fundamental principle that with rights come responsibilities. Worst yet, we are governed by people who do not represent us, who do not act in the best interests of our nation and of our children, and are placing our common future at great risk. That is the status quo we face, and we all remember what Ronald Reagan said about the status quo. That's Latin for the mess we're in. Fortunately, well, you can't ever go wrong quoting the Gipper, can you, Mr. Deese? Well, fortunately, there's no second American Revolution in the offing. But soon Americans will go to the polls and vent their anger, as they should and they must. But we can understand the value of Paine today, and we have to understand the vast gulf that lies between the Americans of his day and the Americans of today. How often have we seen baseball players mouthing the words of the national anthem? What does it mean to them that we are the land of the free and the home of the brave? It means too little, because Americans for so many generations have assumed that our freedoms are inviolable, and our leaders have not called upon us to make any sacrifice or bear any burden other than the taxes they throw at us to ensure those rights. Freedom to us, to many of us, to too many of us, is an impersonal abstraction. Contrast that to where America was when Paine wrote Common Sense. In 1776, the concept of liberty, personal freedom, was a personal consideration to each and every American. If foreign troops came and knocked on your door, forced their way in, and said, "We are now going to be staying here overnight, feed us," and you had no right to object to that, that was personal. That was an invasion of your privacy, your property, your rights. It was, pardon me, an oppression that was personal to you. Freedom was something stolen from you at that point, and you felt it deeply. If a foreign king placed a new tax on corn, on wheat, on leather goods, it wasn't just another matter of, well, there they go again. It might be the difference between your family surviving the winter and having to go to your relatives to ask for sustenance. And when British troops marched, pardon me, on Concord to seize the weapons that American rebels had stashed there, you and your neighbors would have been faced with the choice. Are we going to grab our muskets and squirrel rifles and go and stand there and defend those weapons, or are we not? The members of our military understand, because they, many of them, risk their lives every day to defend it. It's personal to that trigger puller out there on a mountainside in Afghanistan trying to call a helicopter to extract his team. That's personal. I think our police and our firemen, many people in society do understand it. But from Lyndon Johnson through Barack Obama, with the glowing exception of Ronald Reagan, none of our leaders have asked us to stand up and assume the burden of freedom. So many of our constitutional freedoms have been eroded gradually, and I think few people really reflect on the magnitude of the problem. There are too many examples of the little tyrannies that fester in our minds but don't spur us to rebel, and they've come from each branch of government. Consider some of these examples. Each one is bad enough, and then add them up in your mind. The sum is shocking. Freedom of speech, the press, and religion are protected by the First Amendment. We all know that. And Paine wrote of religion that the only role of government is to protect the honest profession of it. But over how many years and how many times have our courts protected us from things so outrageous as school prayer or the public display of the Ten Commandments? For how long have residents of many cities been denied the right to keep and bear arms? Even after the Supreme Court's Keller decision, the jurisdiction in which we now stand still burdens the right to bear arms in such a way that is effectively denied to the citizens here. The 16th Amendment, I'd certainly like to have a little meeting with the gentleman who dreamt that one up, empowers Congress to levy income taxes. Taxes are now a form, of course, of social engineering. They are not something that the government imposes necessarily to raise money, although Lord knows there's more than enough of that. But if you're going to tax gasoline to reduce the consumption and give subsidies to ethanol, that's social engineering. It's not taxation for the revenue that the country needs. And with taxation, the government seeks to control our individual freedoms without having to legislate them, to outlaw them, which they know they can't do. How many people here, let me see a showing of hands, how many people have solar panels on your homes? Ah, I knew I was in the company of friends. Well, do any of you drive one of those little hybrid cars that looks like somebody stuck a couple of seats in an empty soda can? Well, if so, if you have surrendered to the tax tyranny. And just for the record, I drive a 500 horsepower Mustang and do whatever I can to enlarge my carbon footprint. While government and the courts have eroded many of the rights, they have eagerly created many more that frankly can't be found in the Constitution. I mention, only in passing, I mention Roe v. Wade for one point and one point alone. It's just the biggest example that anyone can point to judicial tyranny. In the decades since that decision, no act of the judiciary has so divided Americans as the so-called right to abortion. And why? Because it is invented. It is found in a penumbra, which I guess surrounds a right to privacy, which, and I certainly bow to you, Ed, I can't find a right to privacy in the Constitution. I can find the Fourth Amendment, protection against unreasonable search and seizure, but I don't see penumbras hovering when I open my copy of the Constitution. And we kind of laugh and we sit back and we chuckle, but this goes on every single day. Only yesterday, a federal court, of course, in California, said that the Don't Ask, Don't Tell law was unconstitutional. Can't tell him that he can't profess that homosexuality. In effect, this decision says that, and I can hardly believe this, it says that a right, the soldier's right to speak and write as he or she chooses, is now inviolable. So now I guess every private Beetle Bailey can write a letter to the editor of his local paper to say that General Half-Track is a moron. Look, the California judge did not, of course, never, in her opinion, did she mention the fact, the simple fact, there is no constitutional right to serve in the United States military. You serve in the military on a condition. You sign certain conditions of enlistment. When I took my commission, it was on the understanding I would submit myself to the military order and discipline. I would take myself out of the military, or out of the civilian system. I would be subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice. I gave up some of my rights knowingly and fully that I was signing up to do something. These judges, frankly, amaze me. I shouldn't be, I'm very proudly jaded, having been living in Washington for 35 years. You know, you can always say, people never surprise me, but they often disappoint me. This decision is kind of a surprise. Do the courts now believe that it is up to them to invent for homosexuals a constitutional right to serve in the United States military? And is the court the proper final arbiter of military order and discipline? Of course not. Don't Ask, Don't Tell was a poor policy dictated by politics, but it worked for as long as it's been around. And now an aggressive judicial activist has overturned it. Our constitutional rights are now under more of a threat, and more severely so, than at any time since Roe was decided. But now we have a system in the White House and in the Senate which is designed to institutionalize judicial tyranny. Judges are duty-bound to choose from among the facts of a case, those which are more important than others, and to base their decisions on it. But now we have a Supreme Court justice who has said in her speech, one of their speeches, and bragged that her ethnic experiences, her Latina wisdom, would affect how she chooses the facts on which her decisions would be based. That is antithetical to the American theory of justice.